Thanks so much for attending our session. We are so delighted to talk about the projects in support of ethnic studies and digital ethnic studies. But first, we wanted to share where everyone here is coming from through a land acknowledgement. So you can see here. And now we'll introduce ourselves. So I'll pass it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Ray. I'm Melissa Cardenas-Dow, a social sciences librarian at Sacramento State University, which rests on the unceded territories of the Miwok, Nisenan, and Maidu peoples. I am the subject liaison to the departments of ethnic studies, women's and gender studies, and psychology, as well as several departments in the College of Education. Kenya?
I'm Kenya Flash. I am the librarian for political science, global affairs, and ethnicity, race, and migration at Yale University, which rests on the lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, the Shakticoke, Golden Hill Pagosset, the Niantic, and Quinnipiac, as well as other Algonquian-speaking peoples. Ray?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ray Pun. I am the Education and Outreach Manager at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. I'm currently based in the Bay Area of California in the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people, and my pronouns are he and him. Now I'll pass it to Denisse.
Thank you, Ray. My name is Denisse Solis. I'm the Interim Digital Collections at the University of Denver, and my pronouns are she, hers, and ella, because I also speak Spanish.
Great, thanks everyone for the intros. So we wanted to also share a couple of the questions that we'll be covering. Of course, these are part of our discussions for this session. A lot of topics to discuss here, but the core questions include specifically what is ethnic studies in connections to our work as librarians, as whether we are supporting digital projects or non-digital and collaborative projects, and other important questions that we're seeing in the field, particularly in the rise of supporting the areas and the exploitations that we're also seeing. So we'll have a major discussion on first, what is ethnic studies and why does it matter? And these are two crucial questions, and then I'll pass it to Kenya to address them.
Ethnic studies is a very interdisciplinary field that have examples such as Black and African American studies, Asian Pacific American studies, Chicana X and Latinx studies, Native American Indigenous studies, Jewish studies, Middle Eastern studies, and more. In addition to this fact, ethnic studies also has represented within it different fields of study as well. These include history, political science, medicine, arts, literature, and so it's multidisciplinary in a way. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Kenya. And for that introduction, we wanted to also take a moment here to pause how ethnic studies has been affected throughout higher education. And even in Netflix's series, The Chair, which showed a scene where students have showed the professor who Sandra Oh was playing, that there is a petition to save ethnic studies. Now even the reference to pop culture has been received, that ethnic studies is often a critical field, but it's often one that is underserved, always undercut in terms of budget. And so these are important discussions as we are library workers in support of ethnic studies. How do we ensure and support the field when it's going through a lot of duress and challenges? Now I'll pass it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Ray. So let's pause a little bit and read the slide. And then I will talk a little bit about the history of ethnic studies in the United States. It's important to remember that ethnic studies in the United States developed from the civil rights movements in the 1960s and 1970s. It came about through a student strike at San Francisco State University in 1969, led by the Third World Liberation Front, or TWLF. It's a coalition of the Black Student Union, Latin American Students Organization, Asian American Political Alliance, Filipino American Collegiate Endeavor, and Native American Student Union. The TWLF demanded the establishment of the College of Ethnic Studies, comprising of American Indian Studies, Asian American Studies, Black Studies, and La Raza Studies. So this was the culmination, the birth of ethnic studies in the United States. Of course, it has gone through a lot of changes through the years from its inception, but the values of ethnic studies, as defined by the CSU Council on Ethnic Studies, state that its purpose is to focus ethnic studies as not being synonymous with all studies or topics about race and ethnicity. Ethnic studies topics that address the resistance and liberation struggles based on race and ethnicity. That's the more salient point of ethnic studies, that it address the resistance and liberation struggles based on race and ethnicity. Ethnic studies tries to center itself through the lens of those studied, not just as object, but as agents within the study or topic. Ethnic studies promotes the well-being of the people, empowers the people to achieve their self-defined aspirations, and can be used to improve the lives of the people studied. One example of this is the prevalent narrative in academic circles, that the purpose and nature of scholarship is to further human knowledge. Scholarship is for the scholarly circle, not the object of study. Ethnic studies provides the counter narrative of scholar activism. Scholarship's purpose is to benefit the communities being studied. Knowledge and information belong to the people studied, those who are objects of research inquiry. Next slide, please. This leads us to ethnic studies librarianship and the question of what it is that we do. So let's take a pause and read the slide for a bit. From my perspective as the ethnic studies librarian at Sac State, I think that what we do largely involves empowerment and reclaiming narratives and cultural memory through various projects in collection development, including digital collections, library information literacy instruction, outreach and programming, engagement with the university community, and soliciting input and participation from communities outside of the university, but are affected by the work done within. If education really is about liberation, then the information generated through research and scholarship cannot and should not remain in the ivory tower. Next slide, please. This leads us to the question, why is ethnic studies important? Studies have shown that students benefit from ethnic studies in terms of their academic performance and graduation rates, critical thinking, and self-esteem. So how are academic libraries supporting ethnic studies? We do this by providing information resources, research guides, books, movies, media, library instruction, outreach programs, and partnerships. But also we value ethnic studies by bringing it into our workplaces, into the library, and incorporating it into academic library culture. And through extension, academia itself. This brings us to the question of what it is like to be in ethnic studies librarianship. Next slide. All right, and this brings us to Denisse.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience as the interim digital collections at DU. But before that, I'm going to give you just a brief, some more context about the institution where I work and the department that I manage. So the University of Denver sits on the lands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. And this is significant because the university itself and its founder, John Evans, is also inextricably linked to the Sand Creek Massacre that took place November 29th, 1864, 2 weeks after the Colorado Seminary, which is now DU, opened its doors. And I'll let you read about the Sand Creek Massacre because it is truly a really brutal, I mean, it's a massacre, so I'm not going to go too in depth about that, but in 2014, the John Evans Committee concluded that John Evans was culpable, had a significant level of culpability for the Sand Creek Massacre, along with other members that served on DU's Board of Trustees at the time. And what's important about this is that John Evans report was also, there was also a list of recommendations that came with that. And that's partly what I'm going to speak to, but also what I like. It's a result, the CREST, the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies minor, is also a result of that report and student activism and just everything that was happening with DU now. When I first started working at the University of Denver in 2018 as their residency librarian, the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies minor was still in the works, partly as a response to the John Evans report, but also due to other racist incidents on campus. During my residency, my liaison area was IRISE, but also later the CREST minor, which was officially a minor in 2019. And later in 2020, it was officially stated that it will now become a full program. And it's Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, not just Ethnic Studies, which is a whole other discussion. But during my residency, I worked with the IRISE postdocs who taught in the CREST minor, one of which was Dr. Johnny Ramirez. He worked with me and Kate Crow, our special collections curator and archivist, to bring students into the archive to learn about history, because his course was called Topics in History, Chicanx, Latinx, Student Resistance Activism, 1960 to present. And of course, it tied into a lot of protests that happened at DU in the 1960s to now. He also introduced me to the ARC framework, Access, Relevance, and Community. And so when I became the interim digital collections librarian, I brought those relationships and I brought that information with me. And just to give you a little more detail and full disclosure, I am not an ethnic studies scholar. I don't have a background in ethnic studies, though I am learning and reading more about it. But the purpose of access, relevance, and community is access refers to providing students the opportunity to receive a quality education, right? Relevancy is relevant and directly connected to the marginalized experiences of students of color. And three, that these serve as a bridge from formal educational spaces to community involvement, advocacy, organizing, and activism. So ultimately, what Dr. Ramirez and I did is ensure that we follow this framework. And through the archives, through our work with Kate, a lot of the students, we basically allowed the students to search the archives, create their own projects, so much so that one of them, Andrea Macias, actually gave a presentation to the board about the history of activism at DU in an effort to argue that, or to support the No More Pioneer, because currently pioneers is our saying, I'm sorry, And so we don't want pioneers because it has a history of just racism. And so she was able to work on that with us and give voice to students that have been traditionally marginalized, because the University of Denver, from up to now, from what I know, based on what I know, it's focused heavily on Jewish history. And so we do have, we actually have a collections as data project that's working on transcribing patient records from the Jewish Relief Consumption Society. But now we're more focused on specifically Indigenous and Black experiences on campus. And as a result, I've worked to create a new part-time position dedicated, which has a very long name, but it's documenting student activism archives assistant. And Lauren Turner, who is currently in this role, is working on building relationships, creating a timeline, organizing, making sense of the history that we do have in the archives, and overall just ensuring that we focus on that liberation and on ensuring that students have the information that they need in order to donate enough information to the archives while retaining their rights, but also ensuring that the history is known. Like access, relevancy, and community. We do this because students have been asking for it and because we hope that it leads to their liberation. Thank you.
So one of the challenges that ethnic studies librarianship has is that in being as interdisciplinary as it is, ethnic studies also has the perception of, is dogged by the perception that it is incredibly white. So that one of the questions we'll examine just for a short amount of time is, why is ethnic studies librarianship so white? And how do we respond to these exploitations? The first thing I'd like to say about this is when one views ethnic studies within academia, it is seen as fringe or specialized. And so the funding, the staffing, and the enrollment has been seen as additional, except for people who fall within the demographics of being quote unquote ethnic. There's almost an exotification of the subject themselves to some people who are to both the subject, but also the people who are taking those courses. Many of the frameworks that we question within ethnic studies are really highlighted and emphasized as the way to study within academia. Ethnic studies challenges the status quo of academia, but because of the funding, the staffing, the environment, it is still also reinforcing that status quo as well. One of the undergirding attitudes within ethnic studies is to rehumanize the ethnicities who are within ethnic studies, as academia itself sees the people within those ethnicities as subjects to be studied and not as people. So these are some important points to consider as to why ethnic studies is so white. Another factor, and this goes to the way that ethnic studies is also envisioned. Next slide, please, is the idea that most of the professors, many of the people who are providing the framework are non-white themselves. And so the understanding of what it is like to be from these backgrounds, that is also challenging within ethnic studies. So I'd like to go on to the next slide. So other considerations. As I said, ethnic studies are often underfunded and understaffed. The fringe nature, the fringe identification of ethnic studies within academia makes it seem to many other disciplines as if it is only about typifying people who are seen as subject. It's me-search, not research, is one way that it's explained. The faculty within these areas also have a higher barrier to tenure, and often their research is considered not true research. And so it's difficult defining or gaining support for these programs. One of the reasons I'm going through this, the whiteness of ethnic studies, and how even though it is, the primary focus is to rehumanize and uplift people of various ethnicities, they still fall into the idea that there's still white supremacy that is within the frame of how ethnic studies is taught. The reason we've gotten into that is because academic libraries reflect or try to reflect academia. And this reflection is also seen in the investment in resources and support for programs. I just want to mention, as Denisse said earlier, she was not an expert in ethnic studies. I also was not an expert in ethnic studies, and this is something that is actually very prominent in ethnic studies librarianship. I could go on, but I'm going to pass it on to Melissa.
Oops. Thank you, Kenya. Yes, there's a lot more to be said about academia, academic libraries, and questioning its support for ethnic studies curriculum. But right now we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about current events. And this is coming from California and the impact of ethnic studies in the California public higher education curriculum. And these are just some highlights and updates of what has been going on. So California had just passed last year, AB 1460, which is the addition of ethnic studies as a graduation requirement in the California State University system. It passed in June 2020 and signed by the California governor in August 2020. It requires 3 units of ethnic studies courses in all 23 CSU campuses, starting in this academic year 2021-2022. All undergrad students graduating in academic year 2024-2025 will be required to have completed at minimum 3 units of in an ethnic studies course. California community colleges have followed the plan of CSU to revise their transferable offerings. At this moment, CSU had opted to create, I believe it's Area F, where the ethnic studies requirement will be a GE requirement. Now, closely related to this in California, I'm not too sure about the Illinois equivalent there, but California AB 331 would have required at least a course in ethnic studies as part of public high school graduation. But the California governor vetoed the bill in September 2020. And he called for further revisions of the curriculum proposed by the bill. Connected to this is AB 2016, which was signed way back in 2016 that required the California State Board of Education to create a model ethnic studies curriculum. So like that's connected with AB 331. And so in March of 2021, it passed a long revise, a third draft model ethnic studies curriculum, but it's not mandated. And all it is, it's providing a guidance to local school districts with background ideas and examples of how to set up an ethnic studies curriculum. Then, just in December 2020, AB 101 reintroduced what was AB 331. So basically what this is saying is that as far as higher, like not just higher education, but just public education, it's moving towards this greater idea of, indeed, education is liberation, that education should not just mirror the people who are being educated through public education in the state of California, but also that certain points in history are recognized. Here in California, we recognize the importance of Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement by honoring him, Cesar Chavez Day, in March, in a day in March. So that is something that I think is very important on why ethnic studies should be an integral part of curriculum from, like all parts of of public education. Next slide.
Thanks, Melissa. I will conclude with this last slide here. And just to give you some context why we have given you this information about the assembly bills, as well as the exploitations and then case examples, it's because it's all converging right now. We see that there is a rise and interest in advocating for ethnic studies in higher education and then also in the K-12 areas. And as a result, we are also going to be seeing and have seen these exploitations, unfortunately. Now, with that being said, we also want to say not all of us here are experts or have been trained as ethnic studies scholars. I myself did not get that type of training until later in my career as a librarian, where I was a school librarian, and then we had seen the assembly bills coming in, as Melissa had described, and then thinking, how do we integrate and teach our graduate students who are teachers, thinking about providing a curriculum that focuses on ethnic studies within the K-12 sphere. And so with that being said, this gave me this opportunity to reflect and think about a potential publication. Working with Melissa in Kenya, we conceived of this book called Ethnic Studies and Academic Research Libraries, where we wanted to highlight library workers supporting ethnic studies programs, faculty, and students in academic research and public libraries. We know that there's so many opportunities to engage with these interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary programs. And we also saw the lack of visibility of ethnic studies in librarianship and wanted to highlight the important work that our colleagues are doing to support ethnic studies and against the odds and challenges of budget cuts or exploitations, including an unfortunate major incidents that we have seen, such as the murder of George Floyd, the rise of anti-Asian sentiment and xenophobia in the country during the emergence of COVID-19. So this book came out of a series of conversations regarding what and how libraries and library workers are doing to support ethnic studies. And these are some of the examples here that came through for the chapters, such as creating an ethnic studies curriculum in partnership with a faculty, tying in and integrating health science librarianship with ethnic studies work, as well as engaging with special collections that support the community experiences and using other programs, Wikipedia, archival programs, and so much more. So we look forward to having this book come out as well to celebrate the work and accomplishments of our colleagues in support of ethnic studies in the field. And with that, we want to thank everyone here for listening and for your attention. And we are happy to engage with you during the Q&A session shortly after. Thanks so much.